So, I'm going to say a quick few words just to kind of preface the event, and then I'm very grateful to Richard Hayes, who's going to introduce the Cardinal formally. But just to say, this is a kind of inaugural public lecture of the Religions in Public Life series, which is organised jointly between the Kenan Institute for Ethics, the Divinity School, and Trinity College for Arts and Sciences. So you're very, very welcome. We are going to record it, so you can tell friends and family to listen to it, watch it afterwards. And do please come to other events in this series. There is, for those students who are part of the actual seminar, which is the part, we're going to be moving to the Goodson Chapel afterwards. But very welcome to you.
Thank you, Dr. Brotherton. We're pleased that you're all here today to inaugurate this new series of lectures and seminars, and we're particularly honored to have with us today His Eminence Francis Eugene George, Cardinal George, to kick off this new series. Cardinal George is currently the Archbishop of Chicago, and he is has served as a president of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops from 2007 to 2010. I want to draw particular attention to some of his published work that is of significance to help you understand the role that he has played in stimulating dialogue in the Catholic Church. Two of his published pastoral letters include Becoming an Evangelizing People, which was in 1997, and the second one was a pastoral letter entitled Dwell in My Love in 2001, which is a discourse on the sinful and destructive nature of racism. He's also published two books just in the last 3 years. One is entitled The Difference God Makes, A Catholic Vision of Faith, Communion, and Culture, and most recently, 2011, God in Action, How Faith in God Can Address the Challenges of the World, a topic, of course, very directly related to the concerns of this series of lectures and symposia. So, Cardinal George, we welcome you here to Duke Divinity School and to Duke University, and we look forward to hearing your words to us.
Thank you very much, Dean Hayes, for your kind introduction and for your being here. Thanks to all of you as well. This topic that you asked me to speak to, Catholic social teaching and economic globalization, is important in the public conversation for our country and for the world. And this is a particularly apt forum at Duke University. I'm honored by your invitation. You'll forgive me if I'm a little bit preoccupied. Thursday, I was talking to Pope Benedict XVI just for a few moments, because one of the councils I belong to as a cardinal of the Church is the Pontifical Council for Culture, and he came to greet us towards the end of one of the sessions and spent just a very few minutes with us. And when I went up to speak to him, he asked me about my health, and I didn't have the presence of mind to ask him about his. And then Monday, I got home Sunday night. Monday morning, I woke up to the news we all heard that he had resigned as Bishop of Rome, or will come the end of this month, the 28th of February, 8 in the evening. The See of Peter will be vacant. That, of course, means that the clergy of Rome, because that's what cardinals are, we all have churches in Rome, of which we're officially pastors, even though there's always a good Italian priest who is actually doing the work. But cardinals are the clergy of Rome, no matter where they serve elsewhere, as bishops in various cities like Chicago or New York or Tokyo or Kinshasa. And so by reason of your membership in the presbyterate of the Roman See, you gather when the see is vacant and you elect the new bishop of Rome. And that's probably the most public thing we do, although much of what we do is to act as any presbyterate does vis-a-vis its bishop. We advise the Pope, much as my own Presbyteral Council in Chicago advises me as Archbishop there. So consequently, we're waiting now to see what happens. How are we called? When will we be called? How will this proceed? Because the procedure is somewhat different. It's the first time in 600 years that the see is vacant because of a resignation. And so there's nobody alive who remembers what happened last time. But the church has long memories, and I'm sure they'll find a document somewhere that will tell us what we're supposed to do next. I'd also like to make a disclaimer, not only about my own knowledge of economic theory, which isn't very deep, but also more importantly about the nature of Catholic social teaching, because that has implications for the discussion of economic activity, whether globally or nationally or in any other area. Catholic social teaching does not directly provide detailed models for the relationship between government intervention and private economic actors. It does not directly address technical questions about the workings of the market in any area. It does not provide a theory of scientific management of assets. It starts rather with an anthropology that is consistent with what God has revealed about human actors and their works, using philosophical arguments that are theoretically open to the full breadth of human reason, and therefore available even to non-believers. Its subject is not a particular community, but the humanum as such. Its object is the establishment of right relationships, in the biblical sense, in all social interactions, especially in political and economic activity. Each of those claimers brings it into some contrast to the social contract theory that is at the basis of our community here, if we can call our nation a community, and we'll make that clear as we move along in the presentation. Economic activity is human activity and is therefore open to moral or ethical as well as technical judgment. In other words, we are responsible before God and others for the economic and political structures that we create. In 1965, Pope Paul VI, in the midst of the Second Vatican Council, came to this country, the first pope to do so, and appeared to before the General Assembly of the United Nations. And he described himself as an expert in humanity. And I don't think he was trying to, in a hubristic fashion, say something about his office that wasn't recognizable for those who would pause for a moment to consider that the chair of Peter has witnessed and helped shape human events for 2,000 years, and will continue to do so, Catholics believe, until Christ returns in glory to judge the living and the dead. And so the institutional memory of the Church is very long, especially for Americans. That's hard to grasp. I was stationed in the general government of my own religious order, which is a missionary congregation, and from time to time when I visited the members of my own order who were in some difficulty, I'd report back to the dicastery, the council, the congregation as it's called, for the evangelization of peoples. And one time in the middle of the 70s, when I was young in my work there, I had to go to Chad and explain why Oblate Bishop there, my congregation is the Oblates of Mary Immaculate, had gotten into the difficulties that he had gotten into, both theologically and politically. And I did my work. I wrote up a report. I went back and said, here's what the situation is, and they were very grateful for that, although they knew a lot. They have a lot of details that come in. What they don't often have is the context to understand the details adequately, and I provided the context. And then I thought I would provide, in my American hubris, a little solution, and I said what I thought would be the proper way to handle this crisis. And one of the Minutanti, as they're called, one of the people who take care of the files and all, looked at me and said, we tried that in 1642 and it didn't work. So, there are long memories. Obviously also, the anthropology that underlies Catholic social teaching is not a materialist anthropology. There's more than matter. We are ourselves body and spirit, and therefore neither religion nor culture is simply an epiphenomenon of economics, as it's treated in both capitalist and Marxist theory, and many sociologists as well would lead us to believe. Homo economicus acts always in a properly human context, and that is the context that I will not only presuppose but explain a bit before I go into the economic questions that are the subject of the presentation. I'd like, therefore, to start with a few reflections on cultural globalization as the context for economic affairs today. Culture, of course, is second nature. We take it for granted. We inherit a language that none of us invented, and that's taken for granted in a way that becomes self-conscious only when you try to learn another language. And likewise with gestures and the rest, it's the sum total of our non-biological inheritance, and like nature itself, material nature, we take it for granted until it goes wrong for some reason. But it's important, if you're going to situate economy and economic transactions in a proper human context, that some explicit attention be paid to the human culture which shapes economic theory, even if the economists aren't themselves aware of it. Economic activity on the global or transnational scale is only part, therefore, of a larger development in human communication and in the creation of a global community today. So I'll talk about globalization before I talk about economic globalization. I think all of us, you're too young, most of you, to remember, but the Apollo 8 moon exploration project was the first time that someone from the moon itself pictured our globe. And I was a graduate student at the time in New Orleans, and I remember the picture that appeared on the cover of the now defunct Life magazine of this marvelous globe, blue and green, like a piece of jade floating in an almost infinite black sea of space. And we saw both its beauty and its fragility. And I think that was, for many of us, the birth of an ecological consciousness, that now we were outside enough, far enough from our home to see it as a whole. And therefore we began to think, well, how do we treat it as a whole and not just exploit it for other purposes that are inconsistent with its own nature. Globalization, or universal community, however, is not new to human experience. In the Western world, the Roman Empire's 1,000-year history continues to haunt those interested in living beyond the confines of tribe or nation-state. Dependent economically on animal power and human slavery, but not race slavery, slavery based on conquest. The Roman Empire created a system of roads and of laws, of philosophical theory, and of military strategies that conquered and united the peoples of the Mediterranean basin and eventually parts of Northern Europe, Africa, and Western Asia. With the breakdown of Roman authority, the Church in the West and the papacy created a community with universalist claims, based now on faith in one God who created and redeemed the entire universe and who also created human intelligence. Reason, Aristotle said, is open to everything. It takes us beyond ourselves, therefore beyond our bodies. It is, in the scholastic translation of Aristotle's works, quodammodo omnia. In some sense, everything. We can think about anything at all. And rational principles that are universal are the backbone, therefore, of a moral law based on human nature as such, and therefore transcendent to any particular community or political or economic order. The Church, looking for instruments for explicating a universal faith, reached not to pagan myths, which she condemned as false, but to pagan philosophy, equaling its rational principles to the scope of the faith itself. These principles were used much later in the age of Western colonization to endow with legal rights conquered peoples and races whose human dignity was an article of faith. They formed the basis of international law. The Spanish Dominicans, at the time of Charles V, laid it out for him, the Jus Gentium. And they were more respected, despite the canard of the black legend, in the Spanish and Portuguese empires than in the French or British. In the Enlightenment period, universal natural rights were codified as universal civil rights. The civil rights of particular social contract societies were to be judged by this universal standard from nature itself, now codified in different ways in the French and the American revolutions, both of which had universalist pretensions, and reworked later in Marxist theory and in the founding principles of the United Nations. In the jurisprudence of the Nuremberg trials, the war criminal trials of the Nazi leadership after the Second World War, for example, crimes against humanity, as such, had to be codified for the purpose of trying Nazi officials who had in fact always obeyed their own national positive statutory laws. What they did was not illegal in their own country. So there must be something beyond the country and its statutes to judge right and wrong in political and economic affairs. The conflict between newly and sometimes, I would say, arbitrarily established civil rights and genuinely universal human rights now marks political life here and paradoxically exposes the false universalist claims of American exceptionalism. What distinguishes contemporary globalization from the universalist perspectives of empire and world trade, of law and rights, is the introduction of human subjectivity into an expanded horizon made possible by electronic devices at the service of social communication. Sports, World Cups, etc., music, religion identified as personal spirituality that is open to a transcendent presence but defined by us rather than vice versa, are all manifestations of a new human language that creates a universal ambience at the beck and call of a human subject. We inhabit a new space. We listen differently, and we create narratives that have no standard outside of themselves. Contrast, for example, the way in which technology has developed, the use of a compass, for example, that directs us by telling us where nature establishes true north as a certain point of reference, and using radar to find a target that is predetermined by us with a field that we predetermine according to our interests, or streaming music or images that serve the passing interest of a listening subject who creates out of them the world that he or she wants for the moment to inhabit. In this act of creation, in which there can be no single narrative, the subject experiences a simultaneous expansion and compression of time and space. On the one hand, globalization has connected people and places around the world in a way not earlier known to humanity and impossible to human efforts. On the other hand, those very connections have created a density of relationships that can become overwhelming and even oppressively isolating. The computer as a symbol represents the expanded interconnectedness of the world. The young person told me at one point, "I love my computer. All my friends are inside it." The computer as a symbol represents expanded interconnectedness of the entire world, the ecological sense, but the computer chip, with its compression of information into a very tiny place, gives us an image of individuals self-contained and self-directed. The twin forces of expansion and creation and compression both create a lively, energetic dynamic of life and also reveal contradictions within the phenomenon of contemporary globalization. To this phenomenon of globalization, a vast interconnectedness inhabited by subjects sometimes closed in on themselves, the Catholic Church brings a theology before a philosophy, a theology of ecclesial communion intended to be a sign of global solidarity. Ecclesial communion is a network of relationships among persons who share the gifts of Christ, gifts that have a universal intentionality, because he's universal Savior, encompassing therefore every human subject, if not actually, then in intention and potentially. In order to understand the importance for social and economic theory, it's good to go back to the notion of gift, which of course is central to theology. In the end, everything is grace, everything is gift. A gift is a commodity, it's a thing, but with a person attached. Somebody gives you the gift and you know who it is. A gift is gratuitous, it's not a purchase or exchange. If you're supposed to give something in return, then it's not a gift. But because there's always a person attached to the commodity, to refuse a gift is to reject the giver. If your grandmother knits you socks for Christmas and you say, "Grandma, I don't like your socks," you've not only refused the commodity, you've also broken the relationship with your grandmother. The gifts of Christ to his people are both invisible, divine grace, the theological virtues that are infused in baptism, and also visible, the gospel expressed in human language, the visible sacraments of the apostolic churches, the apostolic governance based on authority given by Christ to the apostles and their successors. These are the bases for a vast network of ecclesial relationships, because when you accept a gift, you have a relationship with the giver. So in accepting these gifts from Christ, you're related to everyone that he's related to. And their purpose, therefore, is to unite all humanity with God and with each other in truth and love. The purpose of calling the Second Vatican Council, which very much inhabits the imagination and the thinking of Catholicism in the last 50 years, and will for the rest of the time, the purpose of calling that council, according to the Pope at the time, John the 23rd, was to offer these gifts more effectively to the world so that all would see themselves as brothers and sisters. Remember, John the 23rd was a chaplain in the Italian army in the First World War, And then he lived through the coming of fascism in his own country. He saw the experience of Nazism in Germany and the results of war in Eastern Europe and in Turkey, where he was a papal nuncio, a papal diplomat. He saw class conflict in Russia. He saw all the reasons why the world was extraordinarily divided and why it was going towards destruction. He wrote his great encyclical on peace in the shadow of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when we really did believe that we would possibly be attacked and our capital destroyed by Russian missiles. He raised the question in the Humani Salutis, the document where he announced the purpose of the council. He said, here is the world, and it is now seemingly hopelessly divided. How will it be united? And he said, who will tell the members of the human race that they are really a human family, that they are brothers and sisters? He said, we should try that. We're the Catholic Church, and we have an internal unity that he took as a model, in some ways, an impetus for human solidarity. And so a defensive church, which was the case after the Council of Trent, his reaction to the Protestant Reformation, was told, take down the walls between you and the world, which had now gone through the French Revolution and the American Revolution, etc. Take down the fortress and open the church to the world, not so that the church would become worldly, but so that the world would become more Christ-like. It was a missionary council, and in a certain sense, the purpose of the council was betrayed when it became interpreted as the church catching up with the modern world, rather than entering into dialogue with the modern world so the world would be converted. Because once that happens, of course, if you say that the church had to catch up with the modern world, who are the most modern people in the world? Well, Americans. So it meant that the Catholic Church finally had to catch up with America, which meant that the whole world had to convert, but we didn't, because it was the church's job to catch up with us, not ourselves' job to become what the church was calling us to in Christ. And so it took a long time for the purpose of the council to be digested here and somewhat elsewhere, and only now, in a certain sense, do we see what the purpose was and how it was supposed to work, even though we don't know quite how to carry it out yet. But he saw a divided world, and he said somebody has to unite it, and he said we should give it that effort, because that's who we are. And in order to do that, therefore, you had to dialogue with other Christians to be sure that we weren't at loggerheads with those who also accepted Christ as Lord. And you had to dialogue with atheists, and you had to dialogue with everyone in the world, because the world was loved by Christ and redeemed by him. And so the methodology of mission after the council became dialogue. Proclamation, certainly, but within a dialogue that very much respected the subjectivity of the other person or the other group. So the definition of the church in Lumen Gentium, which is the Latin title for the document on ecclesiology, the light of the world, referring to Christ, not to the church. The light of the nations, Lumen Gentium. The definition of church given there in the third or fourth sentence is the sacrament or sign of the unity of the human race. So the church exists to unite the human race. On Christ's terms, not our own, but nonetheless, dialogue would mean everybody has to listen first before there's any kind of call. The contrast of anthropologies, which is what I'm talking about here, an anthropology of communion versus an anthropology based upon individual autonomy, was clear to me in 1999 when I went to Mexico City because John Paul II was coming to this hemisphere in order to sign a document called Ecclesia in America, the Church in America. I had acted as a secretary for the Synod of Bishops, who were called together by the Pope to look at the church throughout the entire hemisphere. In preparation for the celebration of the Great Jubilee of the year 2000, John Paul II called together churches on the basis of their continents, Oceania, Europe, Asia, America, in this full sense of Latin, South, and Central America, the Caribbean. I acted as the secretary for that synod, and therefore when he came to Mexico City to sign the document, some months, almost a year after the synod, I was invited to be one of the entourage, part of the people who were there, and celebrated in a very festive way at the shrine of Our Lady of Guadalupe the end of the synod. When the Pope visited Mexico City, it was a very public celebration. When the plane landed, The streets between the airport and the papal nunciature, where the Pope is staying, the ambassador to Mexico on the part of the Holy See, as the papal cortege moved into Mexico City itself, were lined on both sides by youngsters. The people who were thronging to see the Pope were held back by a living chain of thousands upon tens of thousands of very young people, teenagers, and men and women in their early 20s. They were a living boundary to mark off both sides of the 12-mile route between the airport and the nunciature in Mexico City itself. These same young people entered into the hotels where the bishop stayed. They controlled our security. They vouched for us as we came in and out, because there were security people there. They checked on us as friends, and they took care of us. "What can I do for you?" was their question. "¿Qué le puedo hacer?" They told us their names, they spoke of their families and of their faith, of why they were serving us. There were undoubtedly police officers among us and among them, but the security officers were not highly visible. It was the young people in relationship to one another, in communion with one another, if you like, in relationship to the Holy Father, in relationship to the bishops, and all of us in relationship to Christ, who made it possible for that visit to be what it was, a very public celebration. In St. Louis, where the Pope went after his visit to Mexico City before returning to Rome, precisely to mark the beginning of the celebration of the Great Jubilee in that city. In St. Louis, Missouri, that same kind of unity around Christ and the Holy Father and the bishops was visible, especially among the young people, and at the main Mass that was celebrated in the cathedral. In those situations where the Church was able to establish the same climate that was characteristic of Mexico City itself, the same response of faith, of communion, of relationship was made visible. But in the streets of St. Louis, the security of the Holy Father had to be handed over to the Secret Service. Understandably enough, they wanted to deliver a live Pope at the end of his visit. But the way they assured that was not to connect him, but to isolate him from others. It seems that the best way to protect in our society is to systematically eliminate as much contact as possible between an individual who needs to be protected, such as a president or a pope, and other people. The Pope was secure, but it was very difficult, except when the Church intervened, to have human contact with him. In Mexico, the protection was through relationships. In St. Louis, the protection was through isolation. During the visit of the present Holy Father, Benedict XVI, to Washington, D.C. and New York City in April 2008, the security was far more sophisticated and everyone was truly respected. But the massive security measures discouraged any spontaneous gesture that departed from the carefully choreographed events we now accept as necessary for security in our country. We're used to isolation, both of the famous and often of ourselves. That having been said about anthropologies in competition to some extent, it will become clear why Catholic social teaching is rooted in universal ecclesial communion at the service of human solidarity. And it depends upon and returns, first of all, I would say, to three related principles: the global common good, the principle of gratuity and reciprocity, and the principle of subsidiarity and solidarity. It's difficult to define the global common good. This is part of the problem with Catholic social teaching, especially in economics. It doesn't get very technical, usually, at least not in the papal magisterium. And so you're left with terms that are evocative and that are important, but at times difficult to define. But that's the way it's intended to be. The definition has to come through conversations such as this, and your own thinking, and your own scholarship, based on your own experience. In general, we could say that the global common good, that is the common good for everybody on the planet, and therefore not just of a society that is organized as a nation or as a city. The global common good, which becomes more and more important in a global economy and a global culture, is a stable system of economic and political relationships in which the basic needs of everyone are at least minimally satisfied, based upon a deep conviction of the personal dignity of each subject. When I was a young bishop, I was first bishop in the diocese in Washington State, the Diocese of Yakima, which is in the central part of the state. And Washington State is called the Evergreen State because the Cascade Mountains do for Washington what the Sierra Nevada Mountains do for California and Nevada. The western side, the Pacific side of the mountains, gets rainfall constantly, but the other side of the mountains is a desert. Nevada, in the case of the Sierra Nevada Mountains, or the Yakima Valley in the case of Washington State. It's a northern desert, so it gets very cold at times, and it can't raise the kind of crops, even when it's irrigated, that you would get in other deserts. But it is rich soil. When it does get water from irrigation from the mountains or from the Columbia River, it produces these marvelous fruits, Washington apples, and now grapes for wine, and et cetera, et cetera. But who picks the fruit? Well, there are a series of people who used to. At one point, the native peoples did, the native Indian people. Then the children of the growers, and then the people from Arkansas and Oklahoma. And then finally, they brought in the Mexicans, and they worked very hard. They're good agricultural workers, but they weren't unionized. And so a group of them came to me shortly after I became bishop, perhaps a year after I was there, trying to find my way in a part of the country where I'd never lived, going from Grand Coulee Dam all the way down to the Columbia River. Never lived in a desert. It's a very different kind of landscape, and you begin to see signs of life that ordinarily in a place like this you wouldn't pay attention to, because you have so many more vibrant forms of life, close to the ground, very small plants. They came to me, a group of these men who were hardened by their work in the fields, and said, we want to form a union. And I said, well, why do you want to form a union? And I expected them to come back and say, our wages are too low, which they were. We don't have good working conditions, which they didn't. They lived year-round sometimes, because the crops, if they were irrigated and there was a lot of sunshine, came even in most of the winter. They lived in basically squatters' quarters, simple, uninsulated wood shacks with space heaters in the midst of a winter that could go to 20 and 30 degrees below zero. I expect them to start with all the material problems that were theirs as people who worked very hard. And they didn't start with that. They said, Bishop, they don't respect us. So despite the material needs, their need for human respect was far more profound. And that's where they started. When I went to the growers to tell them what was going to happen and that they should cooperate rather than have a strike, that was difficult for them to understand, because from their perspective they did respect them, and some did. But what does human respect look like? That can vary according to cultures, etc. But nonetheless, part of a global common good has to be not only the satisfaction, minimally at least, of basic needs, but also the satisfaction of the enormous need that each human subject has to be respected as a human being. That means, therefore, intrinsic to the global common good is a right to be free of violence, to have basic security, a right to life. It means individual freedom, and also freedom of religion as such, not just freedom of religious self-expression on the part of individuals, as if religious freedom could be reduced to freedom of speech. If you want to talk about God, do so, but rather freedom for religion collectively as a community to have a public voice. And that because behind that freedom of religion is our experience of God, not just individually, but in worship. And that means that you establish, through worship, your right relationship to God. And if, in fact, people are not free to worship, then that relationship is difficult to establish, at least publicly, and all the other relationships suffer accordingly. If justice is not equality, first of all, most fundamentally, but rather right relationships, and relationships are different. Relationships between a father and a daughter are not the same as the father and his employer or his bowling companion. Relationships are various, but the important thing to have justice is right relationships, and therefore the most important relationship that establishes who we are, first of all, as worthy of dignity, is our relationship to God. And so there has to be freedom for individuals and freedom of religion as such, or else all the other relationships will start to go awry. And a right to economic initiative and a legal system, therefore, that protects distribution, exchange, productivity, a judicial system independent of political concerns and of economic pressures, such that that dignity of a worker can be respected, as well as the dignity of those who own the means of production. And then finally, a certain minimalist satisfaction for basic human material goods, food, shelter, work, health care, The American bishops asked that there be universal health care in this country in 1915. It's taken a long time. And there are some problems with what we've got now, we believe, anyway. Education and sustained development. That, of course, is a sensitivity that has grown in the last decades since Apollo 8, when we begin to see that part of our basic needs is to preserve the material creation given to us so that the generations to come can have equal access to it as we have, not to exploit it, not to see nature as simply a field of exploitation for our needs, but something that should be respected in itself. It's easier for us sometimes to see that now about nature than it is even about ourselves. That exploitation is simple. This is a sense of the global common good in a phenomenological way. There are other things that could be said, but I think for purposes of discussion, perhaps that's enough. The second relational principle, besides seeing the globe as a whole and watching for the way in which basic needs are both protected and satisfied, the second principle is that of gratuity and reciprocity. And that's not something that's talked about very often in economic theory, and is something that the present Pope has emphasized. It's there in the tradition of Catholic social teaching that started at the end of the 19th century with Pope Leo XIII, but is not as clear as it has become. What is always clear, and has been, is a sense of commutative justice, that is, the exchange of equivalence for which the contract is the paradigm. I agree to transfer this to you, and you agree to transfer that to me. There's also always been a concern for distributive justice, that is, a principle that aims at a certain fairness in society, a certain basic response to needs in an equal fashion, particularly for the poor, without which political support for the economic system would vanish. But the third principle that I want to speak of now is gratuity and reciprocity. Go back to our sense of gift. Reciprocity is similar to exchange, to commutative justice, in that when I help you out, you feel an obligation to help me in return. But at the same time, it's similar to the pure gift relationship, in that you don't have to return the favor. There's no obligation to do so, not in law, and not anything except on the basis of a sense of human trust and a desire to create a human community. You may reciprocate even by helping someone else. A common example that was given to us by a theologian in St. John's University in Collegeville, Daniel Finn, talks about the example of holding the door open for a stranger whose arms are full, or contributing to a good friend's favorite charitable cause. Such an action may simply be the right thing to do, but we experience an informal social obligation as well once we ourselves have benefited from such actions by others. A similar thing occurs in economic life when an employee or employer does something for the other not required by contract, and the other feels some obligation to reciprocate. You have to be careful, because a quid pro quo, if it becomes a necessity, is no longer a gift, and then you're open to all kinds of corruption, which is based upon exchanges that are not legal and can't be put into a contract. But we regularly experience reciprocity, don't we? It's part of the software that allows families, businesses, and society as a whole to boot up each morning, to have the trust necessary to walk outside the door, that you're not going to be killed, that there's a reciprocal respect that will enable us to continue our lives with some sense of security and freedom. This isn't often discussed in economic analysis because it's described to sociologists as their field of study. But it means that we look at economic corporations and other forms of association in a different way. Pope Benedict XVI talks about hybrid forms of commercial behavior as a way of civilizing the economy, namely being sure that human subjectivity is put into the economy, being sure that gift is above the bottom line and not below the bottom line. It's built into economic systems as such to make them human. He notes that the traditionally valid distinction between profit-based companies and non-profit organizations can no longer do full justice to reality or offer practical direction for the future. He argues that hybrid firms, which make a profit, or else they go out of business, but dedicate a sizable portion of that profit to the common good, are exemplified in the so-called civil economy, or the economy of communion. That's his title, the economy of communion, putting together a sense of ecclesial communion with economic reality. I'm not an expert on this, but the so-called Bologna School is, and there are probably people here who know far more about that than I do. But they're very influential right now, or have been, in the codification of Catholic social teaching under Pope Benedict XVI. So we've talked about the first relational principle, the global common good. We've talked about the second relational principle, gratuity and reciprocity. And the third is simply subsidiarity and solidarity. And those two can be variously understood, and they're not always easily grasped in a particular situation, but they're constant in Catholic social teaching because they depend upon a certain pluralism and a certain pluralism of actors, so that it isn't just the state doing everything, nor is individuals unregulated by the state or anyone else doing what they're going to do. Reciprocity, or rather subsidiarity and solidarity, presuppose that they're actors at very different levels, but they interact. They depend upon one another. According to the logic of subsidiarity, the higher authority offers its subsidium, that is its aid, only when individual social or financial actors are intrinsically deficient in capacity or cannot manage by themselves to do what is required of them. So it's not a question of scale, it's a question of ability to act. Can this group, can this person do what he or she has to do in order to contribute to the common good and to live with dignity? If he or she can't, then there must be a subsidium, a help, an aid by someone in a different part of the globe, in a different part of the economy, to help this person become a genuine actor in control of their own life and contributing to the global common good and the economic welfare of others. Thanks to the principle, however, of solidarity, a lasting and fruitful relationship should build up between global civil society and a world public authority as states, intermediate bodies, various institutions, including economic and financial ones, and citizens make their decisions about what they're going to do, but with this comprehensive view, with a view, therefore, to the global common good which transcends national goods. And so the principle of subsidiarity and solidarity is not just a question of solidarity is big, subsidiarity is small, but rather of agency and a pluralism of actors in a just society. The synthesis of this in the teaching of Pope Benedict XVI is charity. Usually in social theory around economics, there's been a division between charity and justice. Reinhold Niebuhr kind of elaborated social theory, Christian realism, that said in private and in familial and personal interactions, charity is first, but in larger interactions, in the case of warfare, in the case of business, it's justice that is the normative principle. And Benedict XVI, in his encyclical on social theory, Caritas in Veritate, charity and truth, which are the only two gifts that the Church has, love and truth, he said, no, you can't do that. You can't be just to someone if you don't love them in some fashion, and you can't love someone if you're going to be unjust to them. And so that neat distinction between charity and justice, which has become in our public life the distinction between public life, justice, and private life, charity, religion being a club over there, and the public sphere being dominated by corporations and government, that simply falls apart in Catholic social theory. Rather, charity and justice move hand in hand, and it is charity that is most basic. The Pope said in that encyclical I mentioned, Caritas in Veritate, charity is at the heart of the Church's social doctrine. Every responsibility and every commitment spelled out by that doctrine is derived from charity, which, according to the teaching of Jesus, is the synthesis of the entire law. It gives real substance to the personal relationship with God and with neighbor. It is the principle not only of micro relationships with friends, with family members, or within small groups, but also of macro relationships, social, economic, and political relationships. So the synthesis of Catholic social teaching now around charity is something that the present Pope has contributed to that long corpus of Catholic social teaching, and explains also the importance, always in Catholic social teaching, of family. Why? Because the family is a school of charity. It's a school of love, where you first discover that you're not the most important person in the universe, that you have to make room for others in order to live together in equal dignity and in justice and in love. And therefore, what is the basic concern must always be protected in Catholic social teaching is always the family. Not the individual with rights, but rather the family, which is the basic component of society in Catholic social teaching. And so if you want to ask how the Catholic bishops will react to something, just simply ask yourself the question, how does this initiative, economic, how does this legal procedure, how does this political movement affect the family? And if it tends to dissolve family relationships, the bishops will oppose it. Because you can't have a society just upon the basis of individuals and their rights being adjudicated by courts. It becomes very brittle, and at the end of it, we can't be brothers and sisters. We're just adversaries in courts. So the concern for the family is always there as a school of love, because charity is the basis of Catholic social teaching. To conclude this part, and the last final part, I talked about three relational principles that are the basis of the whole corpus of Catholic social teaching: the global common good, the principle of gratuity and reciprocity based on gift, and then subsidiarity and solidarity based upon agency. Those three principles are formulated differently in 7 central themes. If you have a book, and I think it was mentioned that you might have it, the Compendium of Catholic Social Teaching, you'll see the chapters that are devoted to the classical themes of social teaching of the Church. Family, first of all, human work, economic life, the political community, the international community, the environment, and peace. The last point I would ask is something that I suppose is the reason why I'm supposed to be here today, and that is, well, how might these principles and these themes challenge current economic theories on globalization? What are the challenges there? Well, they're easy enough to figure out from what I've said. They're quite obvious. The free market is not a value in Catholic social teaching if it means that we imagine that economic transactions can be divorced from the subjects making them. And I think that's part of the critique of capitalism and the uneasiness that many people feel today. As our means of communication become respective of the subject themselves, the subject has to see himself or herself in the larger environment which is being shaped. If it's not shaped by participation in some fashion, it will be rejected. The subject has to be involved. And so instead of a free market economy, which is unfettered and presupposes a non-existent invisible hand, there is what's called a social market economy. It's not enshrined as such in Catholic social teaching, but it's exemplified to some extent probably best in the German economy. There's an Archbishop of Munich, who's a good friend of mine, with the oddly appropriate name of Marx, Cardinal Marx. And he makes a great thing of that name. But he defends very much the social market economy that grew out of the concerns in the Second World War with the collapse of totalitarian systems, to be sure that people are not just shareholders in corporations over which they have no control, where they enter into just for the sake of short-term profits, but rather stakeholders. They are subjectively involved in enterprises and corporations and in society itself. And the basic role of the state, therefore, is not to dissolve the market. You have to have a market. That's an economic tool that's absolutely necessary. But rather to, that was clear in fascism when they tried to make the state the only economic actor, and the totalitarianism that was born of that. So socialism is not part of Catholic social teaching. But there is a critique of a free market activity which is unfettered and unregulated by bringing forth in a rather detailed way the conditions for fair competition. It's up to the state or some regulative organization, unions perhaps, or professional associations, to see to it that the conditions of competition which are necessary for the growth of wealth and economic advance, which has been marvelous in the last 100 years, are nonetheless fair for everyone. Not necessarily equal. It's not a condition that we believe in private property and Catholic social teaching, and there will be inequalities on that, but there should be a tendency to try to level the inequalities at least to the point that everyone has a fair chance of being part of the production of wealth and not just simply a consumer. And what are those fair conditions to safeguard genuine competition? That's what you get in social market economic theory. It means, therefore, that the government is a necessary partner for achieving the common good. It's not something that is the enemy of economic production and consumption. It is rather necessary for regulating economic exchange and to create the conditions in which individuals will be respected and not simply be treated as cogs in a machine. Sometimes we imagine that there's nothing of this social market economy or this sense of government as a necessary partner in many of the classical theories that have shaped the American economy, but that's not really true. We've never had socialism here, but we do have tax laws, and they're progressive. That's a sense of understanding that there's a social mortgage on private property. We do have public utilities, they're not state-owned, but they're very much state-governed because they're monopolies, and therefore the common good has to be prior to the individual profits of people who own them privately. So that we have this mixture of public and private goods, even in a place that considers itself, and is, a capitalist society. It isn't as if what is found in some of the models presented, at least inchoatively in Catholic social teaching, had no American echo. They do. We have a lot of concern about people, about justice, about fairness, and it finds itself into our economic exchange without having public ownership of the means of production in the Marxist sense. There is nonetheless, most controversially, the need for a global regulating authority, because if the economy is global and there is no political counterpart to it, then the economy is unregulated in a way that the social teaching of the Church cannot be expressed fully. That, of course, means that we have to question national sovereignty, and that is a very difficult subject to be questioned in the United States of America, or any other country for that matter. The Europeans have questioned it somewhat in forming the European Union, but they're coming to terms with it now when you have monetary policy that is united and you have fiscal policy, the making of budgets, that is totally deregulated. You can't do that. At some point they either put the two together, as we have in this country, with some pretense of the independence of the central bank, or else you split it up. I mean, you can't go in the self-contradictory way that the European Union, seems to me, not an expert, is going right now. It's the problem of England's relationship to the European Union, which makes it very clear. It's a good case study. But if you're going to say that nations shouldn't be sovereign, which is, of course, a modern invention of political reality, 1648, the Treaty of Westphalia, and that claim to sovereignty is something that the Church has never recognized. Nobody is sovereign except God. And so the absolute sovereignty of the state is not something that is part of Catholic political teaching. Nonetheless, it is taken for granted in political economy today. But it's being questioned now practically. As we move towards globalization, in all fields, culturally, first of all, now economically, what's going to happen to globalization at the political level? Is the United Nations an adequate response? No, because it's a compact among nation states, particularly the victors after the Second World War, to be sure there would be peace, not to be sure there would be justice or charity. And so the United Nations is perhaps the beginning. The popes have always respected the United Nations, even though they're at odds with many of their policies. But nonetheless, they see in it at least a counterpart at last on the political order to something that is like ecclesial communion. When Paul VI stood before the assembled rulers of the world, it was the first time since the Roman Empire that you had a successor of Peter talking to the political authority, not in the person of a Roman emperor, but in the person of the elected representatives, for the most part, of nation states that are only 4 centuries old, after all, and therefore are a passing phenomenon in human history. But what takes its place? What comes next? And the Church doesn't give a clear response to that. They simply question whether or not you can, in the name of national sovereignty, refuse to regulate global economic activity so that it does not punish individuals and take away freedom. And this goes back not just to recent decades, but all the way back again to John the 23rd in that encyclical Peace on Earth. The current crisis, which many have felt almost exclusively as financial, has deep roots in politics and in the related institutions. The big global problems have many names: poverty, war, arms race, energy and environmental crisis, mass migration, genocide, serious situations of injustice and violations of human rights. It is unthinkable that the solution to such a bundle of global problems can be found without a grand project leading to a global political authority. He's not talking about a global state. He's not talking about an empire. And that's the problem. What is meant? A global political authority. There is urgent need of a true world political authority and organized according to subsidiarity. Such an authority would need to be regulated by law, international law, which even national courts are now making reference to. But we're very slow to ratify international treaties because we think they don't give us the same freedom that we have in our own Bill of Rights, and also because they would relativize national sovereignty. And we're the most successful modern nation state. We were never anything else but a modern nation state. We have no medieval memories. And so we can't imagine what it would be like to be organized in this continent in a way that wasn't a modern nation state. So the authority that we're looking at would need to be regulated by law, to observe consistently the principles of subsidiarity and solidarity, to seek to establish the common good. An organization, therefore, which oversteps but does not cancel the level of the state is necessary on the basis of the existence of a universal common good, which cannot be ensured by a fragmented political responsibility. So what does that mean? It means that the moral order, as the Pope says, demands the establishment of some general form of public authority with power. But how does it happen? He's not about to say that, and he shouldn't really. But he does give a few indications. When the Pope was in this country, Benedict XVI, and appeared before the United Nations, he spoke about taking the United Nations into a level for which it wasn't founded. That is, the United Nations was founded so that nation state could talk to nation state and could establish peace through various means. But it was never founded so that the international order would have the juridical right to go into a country when that country's own national government was oppressing its citizens. In other words, intervention, humanitarian intervention. The Pope said you must develop to that point where humanitarian intervention is part of the goal of the United Nations, because sometimes the greatest obstacle to internal peace is the nation's government itself. Somebody has to protect citizens at times from their own government, and there should be authority on the part of the United Nations to do that. Other types of realism that are mentioned by Benedict XVI are fundamental matters that could be managed by a political authority that is supranational: the governance of the global economy, full disarmament, food security and peace, the safeguarding of the environment, and the regulation of migrations. Single states are no longer able to exercise their sovereignty over all these fields, and therefore the new situation requires the building of sites of integration of responsibilities and decision-making. Of course, the biggest thing is whether or not a people has the right to go to war on its own, and that would be a right which would be removed. It's a right that a sovereign has, and if there is no sovereignty except at the global level, and then not sovereignty in the way we exercise it now, then the right to go to war would be removed. And that, of course, is the final proof that you're an independent nation state. We ourselves take great pride in our military history, and rightly so in many ways. We've often gone into warfare to protect others, not to protect ourselves, and we've played a providential role, I believe, in the protection of human freedom. But we're at a point now where if we can't be free by ourselves, and if everyone isn't involved in making decisions and participating subjectively in the participations that are made about the object of global order, there will be no peace. And in fact, now we're going towards, as we know, a war on terrorism, which isn't expressed in national states, but is in a movement, and we have a hard time figuring out how, as a nation state, we can come to terms with movements that aren't politically gathered in that way. Though the problem is to create such a global authority from the bottom up. He says it's a long-range project, but it has to be, at some point, either a public and accountable global authority, or else the world's economy and our politics will be manipulated by powerful nations and by economic interests. So finally, then, I'd just like to go back to the Second Vatican Council and to what Pope Paul VI said at the end of the Council. What I said in the beginning was that in the global organization that we're presented with culturally, there is no single narrative. It's called postmodernism philosophically. But Paul VI said there is a fundamental narrative, along with many others. There's a pluralistic culture, a fundamental narrative for globalization that respects pluralism. And he went back to a biblical theme and said it's the spirituality of the Good Samaritan. The church binding up the wounds of the world, the church in all its pluralism, but nonetheless basic unity, binding up the wounds of a world that, left to itself, will fritter away its resources in divisive ways. In other words, the spirituality of the Second Vatican Council is that of a subject acting within an objective universal order that serves a common good and a common goal, namely the creation, as the popes have often said, of a civilization of love, of charity. Thank you very much. I'm over my 45 minutes, but anyway, you can...
Yeah, we have a couple of minutes.
All right. Well, thank you, Cardinal George, for this wide-ranging and provocative lecture, especially with challenging us to think in terms of whether there is a possibility of recovering a single narrative that could promote a kind of new way of thinking about global solidarity. We have just a few moments to take a few questions, and if I will let you field your own questions. That's all right?
Yes. I'm sorry, I don't know your names.
You explain how social teaching is full of evocative terms. how do we explore and understand the specific content of such terms, remaining rooted in the communal anthropology that comes from the unity with Christ? How can we stay rooted in our faith without filling those evocative terms with worldly ideologies? And especially in this country, how do we maintain the integrity of the church teachings without picking and choosing the ones that are useful for narrow party interests?
That's a question as broad as I think what I was trying to say. I thank you for that. You go back to what I said in the beginning, that God created us as intelligent people, and therefore animals who talk, so that the clarification is in conversations such as this, or in universities and centers that create culture, the media, taxi cabs, corner bars, conversations that create people's lives, but self-critical conversations, so that you have to give reasons for the faith that is in you, as St. Peter says. You can't just simply assert a faith proposition, true though it might be, and then refuse to talk about it. Because faith is also something that is to be self-critical, and that's the way in which we fill in the content for these principles, which can't be decided a priori and aren't supposed to be decided that way. It's supposed to be decided from the bottom up. So what does subsidiarity and solidarity mean here? Something different from what it might mean in China or in India. And you just have to depend upon people as actors, as subject to free agents, to engage in the kind of conversation necessary so that the participation will be voluntary and not imposed. It won't be a totalitarian dictatorship, and yet it'll be united. So that presupposes a lot of social pluralism, but it means we'll keep talking. And doesn't mean everybody agrees, but it does mean that the right of someone to be critical of others depends upon their acknowledgement that they are self-critical in some fashion, which means you have to use some kind of methodologies for what is evidence and what isn't evidence when you come to truth.
I think we have perhaps time for one more question right here.
Okay, Father Columba, St. James Catholic Church, Henderson. Why didn't the church recognize the Treaty of Westphalia in terms of sovereignty of nations? And then why does the church send nuncios or ambassadors to those nations?
Keep the conversation going, because there are a lot of things. I mean, the Pope is sovereign in the sense that he has no superior, and he's personally sovereign. It's not the Vatican City State, which is just a golf course. If there were no lands there, the Pope would still receive ambassadors and send them, nuncios, as they're called. It's something like England. Now, we don't really have an ambassador to England, technically. We have an ambassador to the Court of St. James, because the Queen in Parliament is sovereign, whether she has any land or not. She has no superior. And so that's true for the Holy Father as well. He's sovereign in his person. And so he has nobody above him. That means he has to be able to carry on a conversation with other sovereigns. Whether the nation is sovereign or a person is sovereign, it's a conversation of sovereignties. Or else there will be no acknowledgement that there is one who is sovereign of us all. So the Pope enters into those conversations in a very different way, not for economic and political reasons, but to be sure that certain values are not forgotten in the international conversation. And there's acknowledgement of our divine origin, creation, etc. And so it's a very different kind of conversation in the nunciatures than it might be in regular embassies. But you live where you are. And the Catholic Church has never been a department of state, even though when there's been a union of church and state in some places, the church insisted always that she could govern herself, and she had that argument from the time of the Roman Empire. So you live where you are, and if you're going to influence, the public conversation, then you have to enter into it like all the other actors. The problem with the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648 that it was based upon that famous dictum, cuius regio, eius religio, so that there was a uniformity of religion within a territory depending upon the religion of the monarch. So there was a claim to sovereignty, to absolutism, that's intrinsic to the nature of the nation state, and leads inevitably, I would argue, to totalitarianism, unless you can control it through what we have controlled it by up until now, an independent judiciary and a genuinely representative parliament or Congress, etc. When those things are weakened, then the totalitarian nature of the state becomes very clear. But its nature is to be sovereign, that is to gather all power within itself. And so if you're going to present that, then who will be critical of that? Well, in this case, the Holy See constantly has been critical of that.
I'm sorry that we're out of time, but we want to thank Cardinal George for the stimulating lecture and for raising many topics that would merit much longer conversation, and we look forward to opportunities to do that. Thank you very much.